Center. We offer a cultural, political, and relational home for Jews in Los Angeles. Our work is deeply rooted in the principles of feminism, anti-racism, and pluralism. Our events, offerings, and gatherings are all founded in a diasporic tradition of here-ness. This ever-growing community is full of seekers and learners, and always welcoming of new voices and perspectives to further shape who we are and what we do. So we know there will be questions during the presentation. Definitely encourage you to have them. We will be answering them at the end of the presentation. That said, since we've closed chat, you can communicate them to me. I'm John DA, he, him pronouns. If you send them to me on the chat, and we'll remind you of this often, if you send me your questions on the chat at any time, I'll mark them down and then pass them along to the moderator when it's time for questions. And I think, yeah, we can close out of the presentation. With that, I want to pass it along to the Eastside Jews Activist Collective member, Alex Billett, who's going to frame this conversation for us a little bit and kind of explain why we chose this topic for today.
Thanks very much, John. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex. I'm a member of the Eastside Jews Activist Collective. I want to say a few words about why we chose this topic to present at this moment in time. The past few years have, as we all know, very much ripped the rug out from many American Jews. The election of Donald Trump, the return of open and bald-faced fascism to the political mainstream, these have confirmed in sometimes violent ways that anti-Semitism never really went away. And it's just as much woven into the American experience as racism, white supremacy, sexism, queer phobia, albeit in very unique and different ways for each of them, but in ways that also intersect. And with that has come this renewed discussion of what it means to be a Jew in America and in the world right now. Now, without pretending we can offer any kind of definitive answer to this question, SJAC wanted to present on this topic, not just because it's overlooked and ignored, though it is, and up until recently was almost completely forgotten, but because it points to a complexity, a wide set of ambiguities, these quarrels over the definition of Jewish identity and what it means to defend it, who gets to defend it. It's a conversation that seems to always take place in any diasporic culture, but I think it takes on a new relevancy today, not just in further uncovering the history of Jewish radicalism, which we stand in, but in constantly rediscovering the impulse to reinvent, to renew. It's a fundamentally and organically democratic impulse, I would say, first and foremost. And I think it's also an intrinsic part of Tikkun Olam. And as we head into this new year, 5781, a new year that unfortunately looks to be a very trying one, as we try to put the act of Tikkun Olam, of reparation, into practice, we're hoping this revived history can be sort of one more tool in our tool belt, one more arrow in our quiver. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to our facilitators, Kelsey Goldberg and Benina Stern.
Hi, I am Kelsey Goldberg. I am also a member of the Eastside Jewish Activist Collective, and this is Benina Stern.
Hi.
And we're going to be conducting 2 interviews today. First with Tony Michels, who I will give a proper introduction to in a moment. And second, Benina will be interviewing members of IRN-JU and Pink Peacock. So if we can go ahead and spotlight Tony. And as John mentioned earlier, we will be doing a Q&A after you've seen both interviews. Benina's has been recorded in advance because of the time difference between here and Scotland. So please, even while you're listening to my interview with Tony or the video, go ahead and message John questions and we will facilitate them during the Q&A. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Tony Michels. He is a teacher of American Jewish history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he is also the director of the Moshe Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies. He is the author of A Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialists in New York, the editor of Jewish Radicals, a documentary, and he's writing a book on the Russian Revolution and its impact on American Jewish life, which is to say, he's the perfect guest to interview for this topic. Hi, Tony. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction.
Of course. So I think if you agree, we should maybe start at the beginning and discuss just what a Yom Kippur Ball is, because I imagine many people watching have never heard of it before.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the late 1880s, when the Jewish workers' movement in the United States was getting off the ground, and in London, some radicals, mostly anarchists, started organizing Yom Kippur Balls. These were basically part celebrations and part protests against religious tradition. And they were protests against religious tradition on the presumption that capitalism, the state, and religion were three parts of a single web of oppression that needed to be torn down. And these lasted for about 10 to 12 years. And then leftists, again, mostly, we're really talking about anarchists by this point, decided not to celebrate or hold these Yom Kippur Balls anymore. For a variety of reasons we can talk about later. But the original idea was to protest religion in Jewish neighborhoods.
Awesome. And can you provide a little context? What was Jewish life, both religious or just daily, so we get a sense of what the anarchists were pushing back against? What was sort of the average life of a Jew back then?
The average life of a Jew on the Lower East Side, which is Lower East Side of New York City, where in America this is the place where the Yom Kippur Ball started. There were, by this point in the late 1880s, there were 100,000 or more Jews on the Lower East Side, mostly Yiddish-speaking immigrants from Eastern Europe, from the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Romania. And most of them were wage workers. They were mostly workers working in the clothing industry and some other industries. It was very hard. Life was very, very difficult. They worked long hours for low pay. The living conditions were terrible. They lived a very hard life. Ironically, religiosity was actually on the defensive at this time period. It didn't form, the rabbis or the Orthodox Jews did not form a monolithic establishment as they had in traditional communities of Eastern Europe. They were actually thought of themselves as embattled in America in the chaos of these immigrant neighborhoods. So there was actually a drift away from religion taking place at the very moment the Yom Kippur Ball started. And the Yom Kippur Balls were reflections of these new currents in which political radicalism and atheism that went along with it started to take shape. So it was a reflection of anarchism, socialism, the Yom Kippur Balls, that started in the late 1880s. Reflected really deep cultural and social changes taking place, starting with the very class structure of Jewish life.
Interesting. Can you go into a little bit more on those pre-existing tensions, both in terms of class structure and just more secular versus religious aspects of the community?
So the class structure on the Lower East Side, I'm talking about the Lower East Side and neighborhoods like that in cities around the United States, was basically this: the vast majority of immigrant Jews were workers. Some were peddlers or small business owners who were trying to claw their way up and out of the working class. Economic and social life was really quite chaotic. There was lots of unemployment, or sometimes there was or there was employment with terribly long work hours. So there were these swings where in one season you might be unemployed, in another season you were working 6 days a week or more, working 50, 60, 70, 80-hour weeks. So there was that part of it. Family life was kind of in disarray because immigration disrupted the nuclear family. Communal life was in disarray because deep Jewish communal structures of Eastern Europe were not transplanted here. There weren't many rabbis. Many of the immigrants and many of the rabbis who came here simply had very little influence or power. Many of the immigrants were young, on the young side, teenagers, people in their 20s. Many were younger, many were older, but there were a lot in that age category. And a lot of them were searching for something new, something that, new ideas, new forms of organization that offered ways to make their lives better, so they could make more money, trade unions, socialist ideas of atheism, secular culture, literature, all these things were swirling around in the atmosphere of the Lower East Side, mostly thanks to a smallish community of radical intellectuals who served as the tribunes of radical ideas, whether they were cultural, political, or what have you. And in almost every immigrant community in the United States, Jewish community, you could find these kinds of communities that I just sketched out on a larger or smaller scale.
Interesting. So I know you mentioned anarchists, but anarchists, who were the key architects of these balls? Mm-hmm.
They were mostly anarchists. These were names that have long been forgotten. They were these were people who were in their teens and 20s. Many of them had gotten some secular schooling in Eastern Europe, in the Russian Empire before coming here. Many were already drifting away from religion and rebelling against tradition before they came to the United States, and they just continued that process. So they saw themselves as intellectuals. That was the word that was used, which meant that they were students or former students and political radicals trying to get a footing in the United States. They were lecturers, they were writers, they were journalists. Some of them became later doctors, dentists, lawyers, political professionals. And they were just still learning themselves about anarchism or other radical ideologies. Again, the names now are mostly forgotten. But at the time, they were just, some of these people being quite influential in their own day. Then there were some socialists, meaning Marxists, who also were involved in these early Yom Kippur Balls. I can give you one name. One of the most famous atheists of the time was named, well, in English, his name would be pronounced Benjamin Feigenbaum, but in Yiddish it was Benjamin Feigenboin. And he was really one of the main ringleaders of atheism, but as a socialist, a Marxist, not as an anarchist. Eventually, most socialists said, you know what, religion is a private matter. That was the official view of the Marxists by the 1890s. He said, religion's a private affair. If you want to fast on Yom Kippur, that's fine. You can still be a good socialist and a good worker and a good union activist and go to shul on Yom Kippur and fast. And you should do that. And really, socialists should stay out of that kind of private matter. Anarchists at that time had a different view about this. They viewed religion as part of a larger structure of oppression at that time in the 1890s. The famous anarchists to come out of this, in answer to your question, the famous anarchists to come out of this scene were Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman. They eventually kind of drifted away somewhat from the Yiddish-speaking scene, not totally. They never broke their ties to the Jewish immigrant world, but they had a foot in the English-speaking world where a lot of the other Yiddish anarchists really decided to stay within the immigrant Jewish working class.
Yeah, I like to think, I don't know if this is true, but I think it's very fitting that one of Emma Goldman's most famous quotes is that I don't want to be part of any revolution or if your revolution doesn't have dancing, yeah, I don't want to be a part of it. And then she was part of these like dancing sort of celebrations. Right. That was a very butchered paraphrasing of her quote. So it sounds like even like the Jewish anarchists in terms of participation in these balls were somewhat separated from non-Jewish anarchists, that this was very much a like Jewish and anarchist form of rebellion, or was there like, where were the Goyim in all this?
Believe it or not, originally they were quite close to this. And here the Goyim are Germans, German-speaking immigrants. Not some of them were Jews, but most were a Protestant or Catholic background, and were understood as Germans here. They were understood as ethnic Germans, if that makes sense. And there were a lot of Germans on the Lower East Side in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. So when Jews started arriving in really large numbers, this area was, or the Lower East Side was already known as Klein Deutschland, or Little Germany. It was heavily German. And a lot of the young Jewish radicals started socializing with the Germans. They had some common ground in language, either because the Jews knew German, or because Yiddish was close enough to German that they could pick up German. And so they learned a lot from the German radicals. Again, they associated with them. They went to hear their lectures. Sometimes they became friends. Emma Goldman was very close to the leading German anarchist named Johann Most, who had an unrequited love affair with Emma Goldman. He was in love with her. So there were ties. And so Jews adopted and adapted a good number of these ideologies, whether it's Marxism, anarchism, or again, some other combination, from Germans initially in the 1880s or 1890s. Many of the Jews learned from the Germans, who helped them get started in building their own Jewish workers movement. But once the Jewish workers movement, the Jewish labor movement got going, as it did by the late 1880s and really into the 1890s, the Jews had their own mass movement. They were now the dominant population of the Lower East Side. So they kind of took over, they kind of shoved out the Germans just by their sheer numbers. They built a much larger workers movement, the Jewish workers movement, in which Yiddish was the lingua franca. And, they started doing their own thing.
That's interesting. What were some of the key aims of these balls? I know they were part of a larger move to sort of stick the middle finger up at religion, but in terms of all the tactics of all the days you could use to kind of, punk out against religion, why Yom Kippur Balls?
Well, it was the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. And that was really the reason. It was done entirely out of spite. It was to make the strongest statement possible of atheism and opposition to religion. That was the reason. And I guess the secondary purpose was, of course, to do something together as Jews. The calendar, the calendar year. Jewish radicals had all sorts of events, of all sorts of celebrations, honoring one person or one important date in revolutionary history. That could be the occasion, some anniversary or a cause, a fundraiser. There were balls, masquerade balls, all sorts of balls, parties, concerts. These things dotted the calendar every year. So the Yom Kippur Ball was just one of many, many celebrations on the Lower East Side organized by radicals. This one, though, was meant, as you say, to give the middle finger to religion.
What was the reaction from both the religious community and maybe some of just the larger Jewish Brooklyn community how were these received?
Overall, with anger and horror. Rabbis, both Orthodox and Reform rabbis, thought this was terrible. A lot of everyday average Jews were highly offended by it. You had a tiny minority that said, "Oh, this is kind of interesting. I'm getting in, I'm going to go to this ball." So you had a really small minority that gravitated to this sort of thing. But overall, religious and communal leaders were very opposed to this. Then there were some businessmen too who actually, there was at least on one occasion, an owner of one of these halls. So the organizers rented a hall. They used to be all over the place. You could rent a hall for one occasion or another. And at least on one occasion I can think of, one of the owners had to give back the deposit that the anarchists gave for the ball because he said, "Look, I don't want to be boycotted by the rest of the Jewish community. So you can't hold your ball here and here's your money back." But it gives you a sense of what the communal mood was. Most Jews really opposed to this and were offended by it.
Interesting. So I'm gonna ask some questions about that before we move from the balls into the streets. What were these balls like? Like, what did you do? Did they mimic anything of like Yom Kippur traditions? Were they just parties?
They were a combination. There were certainly parties with dancing and food, plenty of food. Pork was served just to add to the outrage of it, the outrageousness of it. There was pork served. There were literary readings, poetry. You know, some of the anarchists and even some of the socialists, before the Marxists, before they changed their mind about attacking religion, wrote various anti-religious tracts. Sometimes they were spoofs of prayers. Other times they were just poems that attacked religion. So these kinds of texts were read. You know, so there were readings. And then there was music and dancing. And so it was a combination of literature and fun and political statements.
And in terms of executing this, like how was, you know, was there a core anarchist group who really like bottom lined everything from like the printing of posters, the taking of tickets, the cooking, all that stuff? Was the anarchist community just really close knit and it was like mutual aid? How did it?
Every city had its own Jewish anarchist group, and the groups weren't large. You know, we're talking about a pretty small associations, and these were basically clubs. They didn't use the word club typically, but you know, they had names like, you know, Pioneers of Liberty or Knights of Liberty or something like that. These were the typical kinds of names, and liberty was stressed often because freedom, individual freedom, is a crucial anarchist value to this day. And so these themes of liberty and freedom were typical. And yeah, there was only, you know, there were one or two in any given neighborhood. And then there were often anarchist reading groups, women, men, mixed gender reading groups that were anarchists as well. And they could participate and help with the organizing. As you say, tickets were sold. Often tickets were sold out of the offices of the Yiddish Anarchist newspaper, which was on the Lower East Side, called the Freie Arbeiterstimme, the Free Voice of Labor. So you could pick up your tickets there, or maybe a bookstore, or who knows, maybe even a cafe. These are the places where radicals hung out. And you know, someone was appointed, some organizing committee was set up, and you know, someone had to go rent the hall, raise money, sometimes borrow money, and organize the entertainment, and hire the lecturers, and do all that those sorts of things.
Awesome. And it's interesting because I feel like when I hear the term balls, I associate it with like the upper class and the not necessarily like immigrant workers from Brooklyn. Was it a way of like, what was it how do I put this? Like, was it fancy? Was it where you're like best dressed, or is that just like the term they had for those kind of dances at the time?
Okay, I think a couple. I can't answer your question with full and total confidence, but my understanding is this: that the word ball derives from the upper classes, but had circulated down to every part of American society. I think it was used to connote a special occasion. I think people did dress up to the best they could. You know, we're talking about poor people, but I believe people dressed up. Now, here it's also important to remember that people were more formal back then than they are today. So it was entirely common to put on a tie and a jacket and a fancy dress, or a knockoff of a fancy dress, more likely, you know, or a knockoff of a fancy hat with feathers. And, you know, these were even radical women and men would put on proper attire as a way of asserting their own sense of respectability on any number of happy occasions. So I believe this happened. You know, people didn't come in their work clothes. And you know, kind of another thing to remember here is that typically poor people certainly in that age, didn't revel in their poverty. They didn't want to wear work clothes. You know, they wanted to dress up on special occasions. And so my understanding is that's what they did for this. You could get fancier clothes fairly inexpensively. Again, they were knockoffs. They might not be good quality, but look, Jews were tailors, you know, and they were seamstresses. They lived in the heart of the garment district, so they had easy access to clothing. Even again, if it was cheaper clothing, or not cheap, well, less expensive clothing, not necessarily well made, but looked, nicer than their work clothes. So I think am I losing sight of your question?
No, I think that was perfect, just to make sure, like, get a sense of that. Benina will touch on this more when she interviews Pink Peacock, but I'm wondering, in terms of one of the aims, was there an aim of using these balls or even the full calendar of events to create a distinct secular but also Jewish community, or was it really just secular but they were kind of regionally siphoned off from everyone but the German immigrants?
In these early years of the Jewish labor movement in the late 19th century, in 1880s, 1890s, everybody was aware that they were building a Jewish workers movement. That was the term used, the Jewish workers or labor movement. Everyone was Jewish. Yiddish was the language that all used. Even the Russian-speaking Jews used it. It was the instrument of organization, of enlightenment, political propaganda. And they lived almost entirely among Jews. As I said, even the Germans moved out eventually. So they lived in an entirely Jewish social world. And the Jewish workers movement reflected that. But in those early years, nobody thought of themselves as building a Jewish culture. So the Yom Kippur Ball was not meant to be a new kind of Jewish culture, Jewish ritual. That's not how they thought of it. They thought they were breaking from Jewish tradition. I should put it even just to drive this point home. No one spoke of Jewish culture back then. There was Jewish religion, religious tradition, Jewish religious rituals, things like that. But a Jewish culture in a secular sense, that notion hadn't come into existence yet. Not anyway on the Lower East Side and these other immigrant neighborhoods. That would come in the next decade. That would start to come into existence in the early 1900s, but not in the late 19th century. So no, that wasn't their understanding. When they were publishing a Yiddish poem, when someone would put out a Yiddish magazine, their thinking was not, oh, we're building Yiddish culture. Their idea was, we're using Yiddish to educate and radicalize the masses, and we can do this, we should do this with a short story, we can do this with a poem, we can translate Karl Marx into Yiddish. That's what we're doing. We're just translating other things into Yiddish and propagandizing and agitating using Yiddish. But the idea that they were building a culture, that didn't come into existence in this heyday of the Yom Kippur Ball.
Awesome. So sort of zooming out from just like the Jewish anarchist community, I know you mentioned that they were received very poorly, but they were received like violently in some instances too, right? Like there were riots. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I don't know a great deal about it really. It's just that there were these fights and arguments and so on. I mean, this was also a volatile period. Strikes often broke out in violence. It was the immigrant life was volatile. Consumer boycotters might wind up, the famous kosher meat boycott of 1902 saw housewives, religious Jewish housewives in physical altercations with the police or people who broke the boycott, scabs. So unrest was really common in this time period. And that also was evident in the fights that broke out over the Yom Kippur Balls. But in that case, you're talking about or religious Jews who were really angry about it.
Interesting. Speaking strictly for myself, it is very good to know that loathing of scabs is a long-held Jewish tradition as someone who comes from a long line of union organizers. Yeah. So the balls only lasted for, you said, like 10 to 12 years. Mm-hmm. Why did they die out?
Mm-hmm. They died out for a few reasons. One was that a lot of anarchists, so for the socialists, I already mentioned that the socialists developed a position that said religion's a private matter. So they already ducked out of this fairly early on. Anarchists, a few things happened. One was that the original anarchists were getting older by this point. They were no longer 18-year-olds. They were getting older. They had families, and they could see that look, they weren't rebelling against their parents anymore. They didn't feel the need to rebel at that point. You know, that's one. I think the second was a certain maturity. Well, that was what was going on, a certain maturity. They just saw it was pointless to rebel against their parents or the older generation. It was also pointless, they realized, to protest the Orthodox community, because the Orthodox community was so weak. You know, it wasn't the old world anymore. You know, they just came to realize that the rabbis and the Jewish communal leadership in America just didn't exist. And so what were they rebelling against? The whole tide was moving towards, if not out and out atheism, then religious laxity. And they also realized that a lot of workers who thought of themselves as religious also thought of themselves as radicals. So why alienate these people who in their minds didn't draw a distinction between religious tradition and socialism? There were many workers that thought you could be both. They could go to shul whenever they wanted to go to shul, and then, you know, vote for the Socialist Party. So that was something else that was a factor. The final factor in the demise of these balls was the outbreak of pogroms, a new round of pogroms in Russia starting in 1903. The infamous Kishinev pogrom of 1903 caused a worldwide scandal. And there were a lot of anarchists who said a couple of things. One is that they started to think that they needed to reassess their belief that anti-Semitism was a thing of the past. It made them realize that anti-Semitism was alive and deadly. And with that, it's prompted a reassessment of the anarchists' position on what was called the Jewish question. The anarchists believed that Jews were destined to assimilate. Not only anarchists, I should say anarchists and most Marxists both shared this belief that Jews were destined to assimilate. It was happening quickly, and it was a good thing. And after Kishinev, many anarchists and so other kinds of socialists said that, well, we're wrong about this, and they started to reassess. And many anarchists came up with a kind of synthesis of anarchism and various kinds of Jewish nationalism. They came to the conclusion that we should feel solidarity with the Jewish people and work towards not only that, but work towards a kind of Jewish national revival through anarchism. And so in that context, the Yom Kippur Ball seemed worse than pointless. It seemed outright destructive and a finger in the eye of Jews while they were suffering.
I think I'm speaking for myself, but it feels like we're seeing a similar thing happening amongst young Jewish radicals here as we see anti-Semitism increase in the United States. Speaking for myself, I think, you know, being a Jewish socialist is more of an identifier than it was maybe 3 years ago when I was just a socialist. What happened, and this is a broad question, but we are gonna start to wrap up. What happened in terms of the radical Jewish community then? So there's a shift towards the Jewish question and Jewish nationalism. What did that mean for Jewish radicals in Brooklyn?
So there was a move towards, how do I put it? Okay, I'll put it this way. In Eastern Europe, the United States, and almost anywhere where immigrant Jews lived, there was a shift, a political ideological shift on the Jewish question. And the basic idea was this, that Jews were oppressed in two ways. As Jewish workers were oppressed on class terms, and Jews as a people or as a nation were oppressed as such, as Jews, by anti-Semitism. So once that realization started to hit many radicals, they started grappling with the question of how to combine radicalism with its universal solutions of class liberation with a particular Jewish response through Jewish nationalism. So how could Jewish national liberation take place alongside class liberation? That was the challenge. And I would say from around 1903, and this is on a global scale, again, I want to stress, that from 1903 to about 1948, repeated cycles of violence, often growing worse with each time, with each cycle, created the conditions within which Jews felt they needed to come to some sort of way of combining their socialist commitments, whatever those were, with a kind of Jewish national commitment, whatever that could be. And I put it in those terms because there were all sorts of variations of this Jewish nationalist socialist synthesis. There was socialist Zionism, there was the Bund, there was various sorts of diaspora nationalism. There was anarchists who signed on to either anarchist or devised sort of an anarchist Zionism in some instances, or an anarchist territorialism, which wanted a Jewish homeland somewhere, Palestine, wherever it could be found, Russia, Palestine, wherever a territory could be found for the Jewish nation, great. And so there were various kinds of responses, again, that try to combine nationalism, either cultural or territorial based, Zionist or non-Zionist, with a revolutionary socialist outlook. And that's what started happening in the early 1900s and would reach full, you could say, kind of culminated with the creation of the State of Israel in 48. And then after the Holocaust, after World War II, after 48, after Stalinism, all these movements died out or repressed in the case of Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia. But that's the beginning sketch of an answer to your question.
Wonderful. That was fantastic. I'm sure that a lot of people listening have a bunch more questions. And if you do, again, please send them to John DA and he will ask them later. And Tony will field them to you, but I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Benina and we can see her interview with the folks from IRN-JU / Pink Peacock.
Yay. Thanks, Kelsey. This was rad. Thank you, Tony. This was so cool. I learned a lot. So due to time differences, we have pre-recorded this interview with Joe and Misha from IRN-JU and Pink Peacock. Wow, the fast brain is really just getting to me right now. So just to give you a primer, so IRN-JU is basically like a diasporic collective of like anarchist Jews in Scotland, and Pink Peacock is this basically like queer Yiddish non-alcoholic vegan cafe that Joe and Nisha are starting in Scotland. They started asking for money to fund it in Glasgow right before the pandemic started, and then the pandemic started, and they've kind of pivoted towards like mutual aid through Pink Peacock, which has been really cool. So there's been a lot of challah making and food passing out and stuff like that. So they'll go into that a bit, but yeah, that's what I wanted to prompt with. And here, John, you could turn on the video. Thanks so much for being here and talking with us. Just real quickly, who are you? Introduce yourselves, name, pronouns. Yeah.
Sure. Hi, thank you for having us. We are Pink Peacock. I'm Joe. My pronouns are he, him.
I'm Misha. My pronouns are also he, him.
And we run Tichos Vapava, or Pink Peacock, which is a queer Yiddish anarchist, pay what you can, vegan cafe. Have I missed anything there? Alcohol-free, late night. We've got a lot of addendums to our name.
That's rad.
Yeah, and like, what's your, I mean, you kind of hinted at it via Pink Peacock, but like, what's your relationship to like Jewishness and radical politics and the mix of the two?
We're both from fairly secular families, but we're both Jewish, and we're also both bisexual anarchists. So,
hey, same. No.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's a lot more of us than people realize. So we've both like grew up in this context of being like relatively assimilated and fairly disconnected from Jewishness, and have come to it later as adults. Yeah. So we don't have traditional Jewish educations. Neither of us were bar mitzvahed. But we practice, we're both Jewish atheists as well, which adds another layer of confusion for the Goyim. But we've been involved in radical Jewish politics for the past 2 years.
Actively involved, yeah, like 2.5 years or so.
Yeah.
Which started with IRN-JU and our involvement with that, which is a Jewish anarchist collective.
Real quick, do you wanna elaborate on IRN-JU a bit? Because
sure, yeah, that'd be easy to do.
That's what we're going to be getting into in a little bit.
IRN-JU is like Joe said, it's a Jewish anarchist collective in Scotland, mainly in the central belt of Glasgow and Edinburgh. It's a reference to the Scottish drink Iron Brew, which I realize most Americans probably haven't heard of. It's disgusting. It's like, imagine Mountain Dew, but it's orange, and it's like tastes more like...
They're going to chase you out of Glasgow.
Liquor, or not liquor, like more like metal. It's gross. Yeah,
anyway. I like it. I think it's quite good.
So, through IRN-JU, we started doing like community building in leftist Jewish context. We did Shabbos dinners.
It kind of formed from a bunch of Jews who are just, for one reason or another, disincentivized from attending other kinds of Jewish community within Scotland, which are essentially just shul or whatever. So it became very much like a community group based around that commonality.
There's not very much Jewish life in Scotland that isn't centered around shul or institutions which are like tacitly Zionist. So for us to feel comfortable in Jewish spaces, we needed to make our own. And then about a year ago, we started working on Die Chosova Pava and making a physical space that fits this need as well. And we're hoping to open...
Chosova Pava is pink peacock, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's just Yiddish, clarifying I totally I love the global similarities between like finding a Jewish like community space outside of shul, because that's definitely something that a lot of Jews, especially in like leftist activist spaces in Los Angeles, hunger for as well. So it's I love a global solidarity. Great. So I guess we could get right into it. So how did you learn about Yom Kippur Balls?
I think the short answer to that is that we learned about it through Jewish anarchist readings and like Jewish anarchist readings. Sorry, I think you were interested.
I actually can't remember exactly where I first heard about this.
Yeah,
but it was really exciting.
I seem to remember we learned. I do remember it was you that had learned about it, and I remember it was quite close to us deciding to set. It was like about a month or so beforehand we heard about them that we started going like, we're doing one, let's get the ball rolling. But yeah, like I think you can maybe talk on the more what was attractive about it and what was.
Yeah. I mean, it was just it's exciting to read about any sort of Jewish anarchist history, because this is something that's so obscured and like deliberately erased from our sort of the wider Jewish narratives about what does it mean to be Jewish. So to read like, oh yeah, there were anarchists who were Jewish, who were in the context of their Jewish communities were in conflict with the Jewish establishment, who they saw as being bourgeois and being opposed to workers' rights, and who like used religion as a way of upholding patriarchy and upholding status quo. To see that this has always been something that like there's a history of this, that we're not the first Jews to feel this way. Exactly. It's just really empowering.
It feeds into some of the wider like parts of being a radical Jew and like finding your place within that heritage.
What about Yom Kippur Ball has like appealed to you, since they feel like so rooted in their history?
So because we didn't grow up religiously, like going to shul and fasting and praying and like davening, that's not our tradition. But
we don't have the same relationship to it as a lot of other Jews would have.
Yeah. And atonement as well as like complicated, and it's not as simple as sort of like edgelord atheists might want you to believe, but definitely at the time it was just like something that we weren't interested in doing. We didn't want to go and like ask for forgiveness. We wanted to have a party and do that sort of in. I think the Yom Kippur Balls are an act of defiance, right? They're an act of defiance against a religious community that alienates you, and so that's the appeal if we were to boil it down. I think
as well at the time there was an eagerness within our community of like IRN-JU and like the anarchist Jews and our friends. There was an eagerness to like just to do and make something that was like ours and felt like ours and like we had ownership over, and like, and this was, and that had our politics and like had our and this felt like a great way to do that. It's like it's a fun hosting event. We can feed loads of people. We can put on Jewish performers, that kind of thing.
It's always been important to us that our work is actively about building community and not just like standing in opposition to right-wing stuff or to Zionism. Like we are anti-Zionist, but that Israel is no way the center of our politics. It's just like actually very uninteresting to us. We don't want to make our identities about that. We want our Jewish identities and communities to be about something that we're building, not just something that we're trying to dismantle.
Like, did anything feel relevant to like today's world, like from like bringing these balls today?
Yeah. So, I mean, the global rise of fascism is a relevant factor that has led us to be increasingly visible in our Jewishness. And to us, that's meant being increasingly confident in like staking out our space within Jewish community that isn't just, I don't know, like we're not afraid to challenge mainstream Jewish community, like where we don't align with them on political issues. So Yom Kippur Ball, it's nice and contrarian, isn't it? So it's an easy way for us to like to communicate who we are and what we're doing. And it's also a great party.
Like, how did the night go, I guess?
Oh, great.
It went really well.
It was lovely.
We were like really busy the whole time, you and I, because we were hosting it like de facto, and we were cooking in the kitchen all night.
I performed.
You performed.
You were hosting all of like the.
I was like emceeing. It was great though. We had a different friend who was working the door, so we didn't have to do that. Because we asked for people to give us donations. Yeah,
that's the thing we should say. It was £5 was like, I think it was the £5 donation was like the suggested donation, but it was all like pay what you can. No one turned away for lack of funds, I think was what we used at the time.
And that money went to, did we pay the performers? Did we pay you?
Yes, we did.
I think we did.
We did pay the performers.
So that went to like covering the cost of the posters and the performers and giving some money to gas, to the space we were using.
Cover the cost of food.
Cover the cost of food.
That was a big thing.
And then I think the rest of it, I don't know if there was the rest of it actually.
Some of it went to our friend's dog needed some surgery.
Oh yeah.
Do you remember that? And we had
That's what it went to.
Yeah.
Jake the dog needed surgery. So we helped.
Rest in peace, Jake the dog.
So there ended up being a little bit of a mutual aid aspect in the community.
Yeah, of course.
Well, I think if there wasn't somebody who had immediate need like that, we would have put it in the IRN-JU like pot, and that just goes to whoever needs it for whenever they need something. So it's almost always empty because people always need something, but that's what we use that for. That's what it's for. Yeah, it was great. It was really. Oh, we led Yiddish songs.
Yeah, we did Yiddish songs, and we did. There was a good mix of people there. There was like lots of Jews and Goyim, and like because we advertised it as being like Goyim are welcome.
Goyim are welcome,
Which
but
we
on
got-
thin ice.
Yeah, we got
Welcome.
yeah, it's one of the things that we got a bit of flack for, I think.
Yeah.
Our thinking with that, I think, was mostly just like, we want to host this Jewish event, and if Goyim want to show up and pay for its existence, then great.
That's fine.
Yeah.
As long as they're respectful, which everybody was. It was great.
You have this party on Yom Kippur, and then how did the broader Glaswegian Jewish community react to that? And then how did you address that?
Yeah, so there was a mixed response, I would say.
I mean, I think actually the Glaswegian community, we didn't really hear from them in particular. The only people that we really sort of, I mean, people might have talked about it behind our backs, but the only people who we heard from were
people who were there liked it a lot.
People who were there loved it, which was great. But we got, there were some other, or like, there was an anarchist Jew in Scotland who posted something on a quite a large platform on Facebook called Anarcho-Judaism, who platform all sorts of anarcho-Jewish ideas from all over the world, and they're a very interesting page. But they sort of published like an open response to our event, and they were quite offended that we'd done it on Yom Kippur instead of on a different day, because they saw us as being anti-religious and as excluding our frum comrades, and also as being very disrespectful by inviting Goyim. So
those were the two main. Those were the only two real points that people didn't like about it. That some people didn't like about it.
Some people really wanted us to host it on like the day before or the day after, but that's the whole point of it, is that it's on Yom Kippur and it's a place for Jews to go and celebrate the most important day in the Jewish calendar if they're not comfortable in a shul environment, if they don't want to daven and they don't want to fast.
It's something that I think we won't. I guess I'll speak for myself, and then like I wasn't anticipating a response like that, because I just didn't think there would be that kind of response. I didn't really think much about it. We were organizing it, and it just took up all our time, and making this nice thing, so we didn't even think about how it might be perceived by as the community. But like, yeah, and so like I don't know, and I do think that like I stand by our decision making, but like it was something that maybe as what I've said before, is like, I think if we did it again, I think we would at least, because we didn't have any statement or anything about it.
That's not true. We did. That's not true. We did.
You had a wonderful Facebook statement.
Oh,
was that before?
Yeah, we did. We did anticipate. So that the statement that we made, that long statement came afterwards, but we did explicitly say, like, this is not, we're not anti-religious. We know that Yom Kippur Balls have an association of edgelord anti-religious, like, atheistness. And like, we are Jewish atheists, but that's not what we're doing. And we talked about that on the night as well, about like, we don't want to patronize people who are frum. This is not what this is about. This is just about making a space in our tradition of Jewish anarchism that, for non-religious people, for non-frum people.
It's for us.
It's for us.
And
you can come, and if you want to be in shul, then that's fine. Go have a nice time in shul.
Yeah.
Because of course we had actually loads of friends. Like at least half of IRN-JU didn't come because they were davening. They were davening. Yeah. And it was like, that was fine.
And like this year we're davening.
And then, we're not davening, but we're fasting.
That's true. We're not religious.
You don't. You can daven if you want.
I don't know. I might daven.
Change your mind. But like, this year we're both gonna fast. Because we found like meaning in that this year.
Yeah, and I guess to touch on what you were saying and to wrap it up and zoom it out and connect history and today. So, I mean, you were talking about how this wasn't necessarily meant to be like the edgelordy, like irreverence as the anarchist Jews were back then. So I guess what do you think the main difference now from your readings in anarchist Jews or your experiences? So what do you think the main difference now between like radical Jews organizing back then and back now and now is?
So I mean the biggest difference is we're now in a post-Churban context. So we don't have the numbers that we used to. Our communities are so much smaller and more fragmented, and the challenges that we face are different. We still live under capitalism, and that is a similarity, and under sort of the imperialism of nation states. But Jewish organizing in particular needs to, it can't be the same as it was 100 years ago, because we have different challenges now. I think, so that's something that we thought about a lot in the context of the ball, was like, does it even make sense for us to host this event, which is in opposition to a mainstream Jewish community that we feel locked out of, when like we're not really even in conversation with them, because they don't, it's so small, and so like Yom Kippur doesn't dominate Jewish life in Glasgow. There's no, like, shops are open, you know, like my place of work wouldn't be closed because I don't work at a Jewish place. I just work at some fucking place. And it's so we thought about that, and we decided that we wanted to do the party anyway. But I think that one of the challenges then is, like, in the context of like the global rise of fascism, doing anything Jewish is positive. Anything that fosters Jewish community is positive. And that's really what all of our work for the past year and a half has been about building community and mutual aid and supporting each other. I think that makes sense. I think and echoing what you said, is like there isn't as big of a separation between like practicing and non-practicing Jews, or like that's not as pronounced, I suppose, and like not it's well, it was 100 years ago, the Jews in London and in Montreal and in New York, where most of the Yom Kippur Balls happened, lived in Jewish communities where Jewish life was just public life for them, and that's not the case for us. We have to work very hard to make our lives Jewish in the same way. Like, we use the Hebrew calendar, which is a real ball ache because no one else uses it. Yeah, exactly. And it's just a pain in the ass to get it to work on computers. Yeah, and we observe most of the holidays, and that puts us in conflict with other people when they don't know what we're talking about, and like don't know why we've taken the day off or taken the week off or whatever. So it's a different context now, but I think doing anything Jewish is positive.
I think that's a lovely place to end at, unless you have any like final closing thoughts that you want to sneak in here.
I think the last thing is just that we think that the other big difference between 100 years ago and now is that the State of Israel exists, which means now that we are at risk of Jewish voices being seen as a monolith, and the mouthpiece for that is just whoever is the Prime Minister of Israel. So doing something that is explicitly against the State of Israel, as a Jew, is also really important right now. And I guess that's maybe the parallel between 100 years ago, that the Jewish establishment that we are in conversation with and challenging isn't that's a really good. It isn't in the city center where I live. It's occupying Gaza and the West Bank, and so the conversation it's more of a global conversation than a local one, perhaps. Do you want to plug us?
Plug it.
Yeah, I can do. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
We are on all of the social medias at D Rosa Vapava. That's spelled D-I. It's transliterated, so it's spelled it with Latin characters.
I guess we wish everybody a better year,
meaningful,
a better year, like of healing and power and revolution.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you all for bearing with us for that that recorded interview. So I'm gonna vamp for a bit. Just a reminder, if you have any questions from that interview, make sure you message them to John DA
And I think real quick, while you're thinking of your questions, we have some, Misha and Joe sent along some art and photos that they had from their event. So this was their poster, like a moon. It says, feasting and rejoicing in the Jewish anarchist tradition. Jewish performers, Goyim welcome, £5 donations, not turned away for lack of funds. That's the acronym. And then there's some Yiddish. So yeah, Misha and Joe were kind enough to send us some photos from the event. So this is the shared space and lots of cooking and stuff. They made knishes, they made rugula, they made challah. Yeah. Keep on going. Yeah, soup it looks like. So this was the Facebook post that they posted afterwards when they were starting to get a couple of comments. So you could read that real quickly, and I think someone could drop the link to the post in the chat if you want to spend some more time with it. But yeah, this was like their thoughtful post that they did. Yeah, Kelsey just dropped it in the chat. Next. Is that it? Oh, and then here's their Twitter, and then their website, which they had recently got up after this interview, is pinkpeacock.gay, which I love, and the website is beautiful. So I think we're going to toss it over to questions. I know that we have a couple of coming in. So I think I have one for Tony, and I'm going to ask you to unmute. And so someone is curious about whether other Jewish political radicals critiqued the Yom Kippur Ball for being a distraction or counterproductive towards achieving some like good political end.
Yes. You know, almost all the socialists, again, when I use the word socialist, I'm referring to Marxists, thought that way. In fact, I found an excerpt of a Yiddish article. I have it here in English translation, and if you want, you can just hear in the words of one of the leading socialists in the Yiddish labor scene his view. So this is what he wrote. Let's see if I can read it. This was a guy named Philip Krantz who lived in London. Well, he came from Russia, then moved to London, was one of the socialist leaders there, and then came to the United States in 1890. And first he was in favor of the anarchist balls, or at least had nothing against them, and then moved away from them. And this is what he wrote. He said that the Yom Kippur Ball was, quote, stupid and boorish from the very outset, a coarse and undeserved slap in the face to all those Jews who are accustomed, even though often many of them are not particularly religious, to thinking of Yom Kippur as an exceptional day in which many things are simply not permitted, end quote. Then he went on to say that such inflammatory methods will hardly weaken religious belief, end quote. And then he said, socialists should concentrate on informing the masses of the facts about the evolution of the world and of mankind, and they would, in this matter, cease believing in a deity, end quote. So he was basically saying, look, through proper education, religious Jews will stop believing in God and supernatural powers. And so it's better to promote atheism through education rather than through Yom Kippur balls.
Which is a common like refrain you'll hear a lot in like organizing trainings is you have to meet people where they are. And I think this was the exact opposite tactic. Not really like meeting people. We've got another question.
But you just also have to understand it's just important to understand the emotional state of the young anarchists in the 1880s and 1890s and why they thought they should serve as the vanguard of radicals rather than, you know, take a step back and meet people where they were. And that is, they were experiencing a whole new world with all sorts of new freedoms. Many had come from Orthodox homes and felt, not all, but many had come from Orthodox homes and felt the need to just cast everything from the past aside.
Yeah, this is obviously like a much more like micro example of this sort of tension. But when DSA first exploded, which for those who don't know is the Democratic Socialists of America, after Trump's election in 2016, there was like some pretty heated debates about whether or not we should be calling each other comrades, from people who kind of grew up with this like anti-Soviet environment in the shadow of McCarthyism and had to constantly answer the Russian question, and those of us who were younger who have never been asked the Russian question because most of our lives have been lived after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
How did 21st century Yiddishism reconcile with the very pragmatic secular program of poor immigrant Jews in the early 1900s?
Wait, could you just repeat that? I'm not sure I got it.
Yes. How does 21st century Yiddishism reconcile with the pragmatic secular program of poor immigrant Jews in the early 1900s?
I'm not sure. I mean, how can it be reconciled?
Or maybe like how did Yiddish, like modern Yiddishism, react to these more secular responses, or let's just say to socialism and anarchism? How did Yiddishism reconcile with those new political tenets that were emerging?
Tony, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, like, and the IRN-JU folks kind of touched on it with what they were thinking through with their balls, and I'm sure any other activists can jump in on with this question too.
It's, the challenges to people in the 21st century are enormous, because there's a huge historical gulf that separates us today from the activists of the first half of the 20th century. So right there, that's the, that gulf presents a huge challenge. I think for those who are Yiddishists in some way, those who want to learn Yiddish and connect with Yiddish and make that part of their cultural life and their political practice, they put themselves in the position of having to educate themselves. So I think that's the first step. If you want to be a Yiddishist and don't come from a Yiddish-speaking home, which is usually the case, unless you're from a Hasidic family, then you have to embark on a process of learning, which takes a fair amount of time. It's gratifying, but it takes some time. So that's one thing that just has to happen. I think then in the process of doing that, one gets a kind of, let's say, exposure to a lot of the old problems that are now current. Some of the old problems are current. We have the rise of fascism or neo-fascism. We have a return of anti-Semitism, which is difficult to theorize because anti-Semitism doesn't fit standard categories or ways of thinking about racism and other forms of oppression. So the good thing about going backwards to reclaim a Yiddishist heritage is that you can tap into really mountains of really important writings that never made their way into English about how to be a non-religious Jew, about how to deal with anti-Semitism, about how to reconcile the competing pulls of internationalism and nationalism. All these things. There's a veritable treasure trove that we're cut off from if we don't know Yiddish. So Yiddish is a great way to tap into an earlier source, or these well springs of ideas that we started talking about. And I think they can still serve as guides. Once you do that, once you gain access to that pre-World War II era, I think it can serve as really useful guides in figuring out how to orient ourselves today. That's been my experience. It's just really difficult though, it's a difficult process. It's a time, what I mean by difficult is simply that it is a time-consuming process. That's what I mean.
Yeah. So I kind of have a question that branches out from that one, and anyone on this call, I think, could answer it because I think you all have opinions on this. Do you see parallels between the Jewish activists of the turn of the century and Jewish activists of this time? And then the corollary to this is, might this kind of rebellion, I'm assuming like Yom Kippur balls and like a religiousness might be valid in our current time as Jewish activists?
Well, I think, I do see parallels with the past. I tend to see the parallels between today's younger radicals with actually less the immigrant Jewish radicals, but the children and grandchildren of those radicals. Because I think since, let's say, more or less the 1930s, there have been some subsequent generations of American-born or American-raised Jewish radicals who have to, who find themselves in the position of needing to rethink their radicalism typically in light of anti-Semitism, and then trying to figure out how to do that and how to reclaim a Jewishness that is palatable to them as leftists and often as secularists. That happened in the 40s. It happened in the 60s and 70s. It's happened since then. There's this ongoing process among English-speaking American-raised Jews trying to figure out how to be radical. I think so. I think that's where the parallel is. But often there's a looking back to the original, let's call it the original generation of the immigrant working class. It's actually not a single generation, but you know what I mean. The old immigrant working class of the pre-World War II era, I think provides a touchstone for those of us born since World War II and into the 21st century. So that's how I think of it. I don't know about how many, I don't know there about parallels just because the differences are so great. Some people, that first generation was immigrant. We're American born. They were working class. We tend not to be. They know Jewish religious tradition very, very well. And often we don't know anything about it or very little about it. And there's one difference after the next. But for those of us since, again, I'd say going back to the 40s or so, can look back to that era of the immigrant working class, and I think learn from it, draw from it, and be inspired by it.
Yeah, I think one thing that's a really not completely unique just to like modern Jewish radicals, but not universally true of radicals from various diasporic communities is that for many of us, we might be the first out and loud socialist or leftist, but we're likely not the first leftist in our family heritage.
Yeah, that's right.
So we've got this like wellspring of tradition, both religious or cultural and even political. And I know for myself, like, I don't really engage much in trying to like parse out which is which because like they're all sort of working in tandem. And then there's this also larger recognition that like assimilation is a form of violence. So what was lost by our people as we got more assimilated, I think. And I noticed that with radicals of other immigrant communities returning to more like ethnic sounding names amongst other forms of sort of reclaiming their culture.
Very true.
Yeah. So I think we got time for one or two more. I got one for you. So do the Yom Kippur balls or ideas behind them have any legacy in the development of different branches of American Judaism?
Have the Yom Kippur balls left a, not that I'm aware of. I don't think, I'm not aware of any attempt until recently to reclaim the Yom Kippur balls at all. I will tell you though about something that happened just something that took place in 1885, just a few years before the Yom Kippur Ball. It's a little bit different, but I think this should be thought of as part of a similar phenomenon. And that is in 1885 in Cincinnati, maybe it was 1883, whatever. Anyway, it was in the 1880s. In Cincinnati, the Hebrew Union College, which was the seminary of the religious reform movement, graduated its first class of American-trained rabbis. Prior to the 1880s, there were no American-trained rabbis. They were all immigrants. And so this first batch of American-trained rabbis, Reform rabbis, graduated, and there was a big banquet in their honor. And what was served at the banquet was treif. Not only treif, but they served shrimp, they served clams, they mixed milk and meat. They violated almost every kosher dietary law except serving pork. That was the only thing that they didn't serve. And now this caused a scandal, and some people called it the Treifa banquet, the non-kosher banquet. And it was, you can imagine, kind of a scandal here. This was not just some party, this was in honor of reform, in honor of rabbis. And they served non-kosher food. This was just a few years ago, a few years prior to the Yom Kippur Ball. So in the same decade, you have two arguably similar phenomena. One was a violation of kosher dietary laws to honor rabbis. The other was a protest against Yom Kippur to protest rabbis. And they happened in the same decade. And, you know, I think in a way that tells you something about the decade. As far as what legacy that leaves for us, I'm not sure. I would tend to think that the most meaningful application of a Yom Kippur Ball that I can think of would be rebellious Hasidim in Brooklyn or elsewhere holding a Yom Kippur Ball. I don't know if that's ever happened. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. It would be very risky to do publicly. It would be very, I just say very risky and take a certain amount of bravery to do this. And I think for those reasons, it would probably be the most meaningful in an Orthodox context.
Wonderful. So we are about to wrap up, but we've got a bunch of questions that in some way hit on this. So I just want to make sure we make this point about the Jewish nationalist question, but anarchists being anti-state. So I know that this is, you know, there was lots of responses to what possible solutions to the Jewish nation question was, but if we could just clarify like the difference between the Jewish nation and a physical Jewish state, and maybe hint at like very quickly some of the possible responses, both statist and non-statist.
So it's a great question. So for you know, starting from around 1903 with the Kishinev pogrom through the 30s, even into the 40s, those anarchists who were either Zionists or often territorialists, meaning that they wanted a Jewish homeland somewhere. Their view was this, that it's Jews are a nation. As a nation, they're entitled to maintain themselves as such. To be able to do that, they need a territory to base themselves in. They need their own territory in which they can build a society and a culture on that land. According to that way of thinking, you could have a territory in Palestine, a Jewish territory, a Jewish homeland that was not necessarily a nation state. So they drew a distinction between nation and state. But unlike the Bundists, who drew a distinction between territory, nationality, and state, the kind of anarcho-Zionists that I'm talking about, or anarchist territorialists that I'm talking about, they actually differed from Bundists because they thought Jews needed a territory, a homeland, and Bundists did not. Many Bundists, just as a side note, did come to believe it was perfectly legitimate for Jews to move to Palestine if they needed to do that, but that was not a Bundist goal. So that now by 1948, first of all, there weren't a great deal of anarchists left by 1948, but be that as it may. By 1948, there was a general recognition among anarchists who were historically anti-statist, and for that matter, a good number of Marxists, even Marxist-Leninists, who came to believe that there was simply no other alternative to a Jewish state in Palestine. That came to be the dominant view on the left, even among people who did not see themselves as Zionists. The view was that circumstances were such that Jews needed this, and it wasn't ideal for Jews to have a nation state, but the alternative was infinitely worse. And so the anarchists that I was referring to, who were still alive by 1948, came to share that view. Again, they didn't valorize the state, but they viewed it as a 48 as something that was necessary to secure the existence of the Jewish nation. One of the leading Yiddish anarchists actually moved to Israel in the early 50s. His name's Abba Gordon. And again, he didn't think statehood was ideal. I just read an article by him 2 weeks ago that he published 3 months before the State of Israel, arguing that statehood, political independence, has never been what Jewish history has been about since the destruction of the Second Temple. He said what Jews are about is a rich civilization with a strong ethical tradition that flourishes and can only flourish in the absence of state power. This is the same guy who moved to Israel not long after he wrote it, because he viewed Israel as important to the development of again, a flourishing and secure Jewish nation. So these are difficult questions with lots of tensions, even contradictions, but that was, you know, such is Jewish existence. So that's again an attempt at an answer at how you know, an answer at how the distinction between nationhood and statehood was worked through by a good number of anarchists and others who you know, did not see themselves as kind of classical nationalists, if that's the right word.
Awesome, thank you. That was almost a mean question to ask you because of the complexity of the answers, and you did a great job with that. Thank you so much, Tony, for joining us for this. This has been fantastic. I don't think I speak just for myself when I say that we learned a lot, and this was such a wonderful distraction from hunger pains for those of us who are fasting.
Thank you for inviting me. And I learned a lot too. I really enjoyed that interview and I learned a lot from it. Thank you
Tony, Tony, real quick before we let you off the hook, do you have anything to plug, or any place that people could follow you at, just in case?
I'm actually not on social media.
Yay!
I'm not on it at all. But you're welcome to write me an email at any time. I do have an email, so so please feel free to write or call. I've got a telephone, so any time. I'm easy to track down.
I love it. Thank you, Tony. All right, Jonda.
Bye. Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tony.
Take care. It's good seeing you.
Put a link to Tony's book in the chat. So thank you guys so much for coming. This is incredible. We had 90 people at one point. That's pretty awesome. And we know that we have people all over the country, and like we said, maybe even other parts of the world. So if you want to get involved with Eastside Jews Activist Collective, we are in Los Angeles. That said, we are hosting events mainly on Zoom. So really, location is kind of not a thing right now. If you want to get involved, we are having an open house on Wednesday, October 7th at 6:30 p.m. PT. Registration is required. You'll need to go to our website, which I'll plug down at the bottom, but would love to see you folks there if you are interested in getting involved more. The next thing we have coming up is Wednesday, October 14th at 6:30 p.m. is our bi-weekly political education reading and discussion group. We read a short article that's about Jewish history, Jewish radical history, Jewish identity. Oh, sorry, can we go back, Shay? Yeah, there we go. We read the article and then we spend the majority of the time discussing it. And it's been really fun. We talk about everything from James Baldwin's article on anti-Semitism to Seth Rogen's comments on Israel a couple of weeks ago. So there's a lot of cool discussion that happens. Would love, if you're interested in just staying up to date, you can check out our mailing list and sign up for it, and you'll get weekly emails letting you know when each event is. Or if you don't feel like signing up for something, you can check out our calendar at the silverlakejcc.net/events. If someone can put those, you know what, I'll put those links in the chat. Why not? But yeah, I mean, would love to see folks at the open house if they're interested in working with us. We are new and we're growing, and there's a lot of opportunity here to kind of define what this group is and what we can do. And honestly, if you've got the energy, we've got the support for you. So thank you guys so much for coming. I think that's it. I think wave goodbye, everybody. Thank you guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Fast.
Yeah, good Yom Tov.